Tēnā koutou katoa and welcome to the NZILA Tua Pita Ora Streetscapes webinar. Today we're delighted to have Matthew Bradbury, the Associate Professor in Landscape Architecture Program at the Department of Landscape Architecture in Unitec and Director of the Masters of Landscape Architecture at Unitec, and Billy Fleming joining us from Philadelphia. Before we begin, I would like to thank our webinar sponsor Streetscape for supporting this series. This is a third in this year's series and we have 2 more scheduled in the coming months. In a moment, I'm going to share with you a short video from Streetscapes highlighting the products and services. So please do go and check out Streetscapes website or contact Paul and the team to chat over some of your ideas for the next Streetscape, for your next furniture program.
Streetscape is New Zealand's leading manufacturer of quality street furniture, lighting poles, shelters, and sculptures that breathe life into our open space environments. Collaborating with landscape architects and designers to share our manufacturing expertise and experience, we create solutions to meet your design brief, your budget, and your project delivery deadline. At Streetscape, we have a great range of off-the-shelf furniture. Together, we can modify and customize our existing ranges to suit, or we can provide the design support to manufacture fully bespoke furniture for your project. With all furniture proudly manufactured in New Zealand from locally and ethically sourced materials, and with over 100 years of combined experience, you can be sure of the craftsmanship. Quality products made to withstand our unique environmental conditions while meeting all local health and safety standards. Local doesn't just mean local knowledge and local jobs. It also means reduced lead times and a local team who manage every step of the way with you to see the project from your concept through to final delivery. Aotearoa, New Zealand, these are our places, our communities, our environments, and we want you to enjoy them the way you imagine them. That's why we go that extra mile every time. Streetscape, turning your imagination into reality. Streetscape, in conjunction with the NZILA, are proud to sponsor the Streetscape Speaker Series.
Great, so thanks Streetscape for supporting this really important series. I'll now hand over to Matthew to introduce himself and our guest speaker, Billy. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Angela. So yeah, I'd just like to, before I introduce Billy, I'd just like to start with karakia. So manawa mai te mori nuku, manawa mai te mori rangi, ko te mori keo. He mori te pua, ka pakuru mai te po, to mai te mori, omi e, ui e, taki e. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Billy Fleming, our guest. Billy's the Wilkes Family Director of the Ian McHarg Centre for Urbanism and Ecology at the University of Pennsylvania and in the Weissman School of Design. I won't kind of go through Billy's great titles or accomplishments, but I just want to quickly say that he is part of a great tradition of important thinkers about landscape architecture at Penn, starting with Ian McHarg, of course, who really reinvents landscape architecture, but it's also other great designers, historians, thinkers, and Winston Spurn, John Dixon Hunt, James Corner, our cousin Richard Weller, and now Catherine Sievert. So very distinguished alumni, but I think Billy brings something of the evangelical energy of Ian McHarg to his practice and his writing and to his thinking. Just to remind us of McHarg's book, Design with Nature, of course, it's a really a clarion call to landscape architects to say that we're not just designing parks and gardens. We're actually there to save the planet. And so this kind of energy, I think, of McHarg, I think Billy's work something in that school, and his work with President Obama and the White House Domestic Policy Council, and more recently in his work with the Green New Deal, really, and his thinking about climate change is really, I think he's telling us it's not a functional, not a kind of technical problem, but actually critically acknowledging climate change is really a manifestation of our political economy that we've had for the last 200 years. And to really do anything effective about climate change, we need to advance another model. And I think what Billy does is very interesting, draws on the last time America faced disaster, which was, of course, the Great Depression, and the response to that, FDR's New Deal, this kind of vast collective egalitarian undertaking, which really changed America and made Americans this kind of new, more equitable, freer kind of society. And I think one of the things that the Green New Deal is really doing is sort of harking back to that time, but also it illuminates, under the galvanizing force of climate change, the potential for a new social realm and new social justice to emerge. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Billy, and to looking forward to his talk about building a post-carbon future. Thanks, Billy.
Thanks so much for having me, Matthew. It's lovely to see you. Thanks to you, to Lori, to Angela, everyone at NZILA for having me. As I'm sort of slowly pulling slides up here, I'll just say, I can see a bunch of folks who I had the pleasure of meeting a few years ago when your colleagues in the New Zealand Institute of Architects brought my partner and I into town for the Festival of Architecture. And it's something, there's something strange about that sensation. Because I can remember coming in 2019 and being kind of in the throes of what would then become the 2020 election cycle here, and then joining you today in the midst of maybe the most turbulent election cycle of my adult lifetime, which I feel like eventually I'll stop saying in the US, but it's just been true every time we elect someone president. So it's nice to see all of you, nice to be here with you. And Matthew, can I just confirm really quickly for you that you're seeing like full slides, not presenter view on your screen?
Yep, yeah, I'm seeing seeing the full slides, yeah. And I should just say quickly that Bill's going to talk about half an hour, and then we're going to have questions. So please put your questions in the chat, and I'll read them out.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to do something a little different than I tend to do for these sorts of things, where I might have a talk that's kind of polished and in the can and easy to kind of put in front of you. It might be work that's known or not known by the folks in the audience. What I'm going to do today is a little bit different. I'm going to bring you into a larger kind of book project that's a couple years in the making now. Really got started not long after I saw some of you in New Zealand back in 2019, and is nearing kind of the finish line now. So this is a book called Building Post-Carbon Futures. It's once again with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, who you might remember were the publishers, commissioners of Design with Nature Now that Matthew referenced in the introduction there. And this was a book that grew out of conversations that they and I began to have as that book was getting finished, about how we might start to do something around questions of what a Green New Deal or a green stimulus or a just transition could look like for the spatial disciplines, the built environment. And so I'm going to do that in a few ways, but I'm just going to kind of get us started here. And some of this is a little bit more scripted, and some of it's a little bit more extemporaneous. So move a couple of things here. Okay. So the fate of the planet depends on humanity's rapid transition to clean energy sources by the middle of the 21st century. But a decarbonized energy system will not be understood through molecules like carbon in the atmosphere or electrons and electricity running through our circuits. No one will turn on a light or charge their phone or notice that their power now comes from wind or solar instead of coal or natural gas, and be transformed materially, spiritually, economically by it. Rather, the energy transition and the realization of something like a post-carbon future will be understood and thus won or lost in the public's imagination through the material investments in and transformations of the buildings, landscapes, public works, public spaces, and infrastructures that a new and decarbonized world will require. So put another way, our fate rests on humanity's ability to translate the abstract goals of national and international climate policy into a more beautiful and just reorganization of how and where people live. And you're looking here at a geothermal park outside of Reykjavik in Iceland, which I'll talk a bit more about in just a moment. But at the core of this transition for the spatial disciplines, there are a series of questions that matter a great deal. Among them are, who, which firms, which people, who will design, build, and manage this transformation of the built environment? Will it be the same mega firms, at least in the American experience, who've also built our prisons and pipelines and plantations? Which communities will be first in line for these material investments in the transformation of our energy system and our way of relating to one another? And how might they challenge through these projects existing power structures in ways that previous eras of mass urban and suburban development did not? So the New Deal that Matthew referenced in his introduction. And perhaps most critically, how will we balance the need to build more things than we've probably ever built, as fast and as well as we've ever built anything, with our hopeful desire to practice democracy and community self-determination? And what you're looking at here is the construction of a transmission line that's owned in whole by a consortium of tribes in the Northwest Territory, or excuse me, in the northeastern section of Ontario in Canada, which is really about connecting a bunch of Arctic Indigenous communities to a larger grid. So a part of a truth and reconciliation implementation program there that I'll talk much more about as we kind of get going. But before I get into that, I just want to say a couple things about the way that our fields tend to think about or tend to work on these questions in ways that are very understandable, because this image in particular, this idea of tracking operational and embodied carbon in the materials that we specify in the construction of the built environment does matter, but in the scale of things is a very small drop in a very global bucket when we're talking about our effect on climate change. So you can see, somewhere in the order of a couple dozen to a few hundred metric tons of CO2 sequestered. You're talking about the equivalent of a few hours of driving in most cases here. And our field has become hyper-fixated on these particular tools for a lot of understandable reasons, mostly having to do with the way that our fields tend to be served through market forces alone. And so this is a very easy substitution question to insert into a market-driven profession like landscape architecture. The danger for this is myriad, and I won't go through all of those sort of questions of what could happen if we were to invest ourselves solely or even primarily in the question of material substitution as perhaps our primary means of inserting ourselves as a discipline into questions of climate justice or responding to climate change. If only because one, the scale of impact for that kind of intervention is very small. It matters in very small degrees in each project, and perhaps in the aggregate could matter in larger ways. But it's very unlikely that choosing CLT for building, choosing CLT timber products for new buildings and housing, choosing low or no carbon concrete or steel for elements of the built environment and landscapes will get us anywhere near where we need to go when we're talking about the scale of carbon management and mitigation that has to happen in order to address the climate crisis. And this is up here just to give us a sense, in the US, a very large geographic country, obviously comparable to the size of Australia, just to your west there. We're talking about a competition for space in this country between the need to sequester carbon, the need to mine new rare earth elements and critical minerals, and the need to build a whole bunch of new renewable energy infrastructure, including storage, transmission, and generation. That simply is going to make it impossible to do all of these things in equal measure in isolation. But our challenges, in a way, at least in my view, again, aren't rooted in this question of material substitution. They're rooted in questions of how to site and deploy this technology as quickly and as democratically and as justly as we can. And I say that because, at least, in the United States, the single largest bottleneck to the implementation of something like a Green New Deal, of something like a just transition, or just the decarbonization of our power grid, for starters, if we want to lower our ambitions a bit, is just local land use conflict. It is not technological, it is not financial, it is just the same sort of NIMBYism that halts new housing projects, that halts all kinds of other projects that may or may not make sense in many of these communities. And there are lots of good reasons for this. People are, wary of being steamrolled in the build out of something like this infrastructure plan. They're wary of, what it might mean to live in a community where This particular view is the only one that they get to see on their commute or from their backyard, whatever it might be. But this is also a real opportunity for designers to think about how and where we begin to find room for ourselves in some of these conversations. I'll talk a bit more about what I mean by that later, but if we think about where landscape architecture was 40 some odd years ago on questions of stormwater management, that was an enterprise that was in the sole domain of civil engineers, that was considered too technical and perhaps too boring for landscape architects who were more interested in other elements of the field to become engaged with. And it's now, at least again, in the American Academy, one of the core sort of tenets of a landscape architectural education or landscape architecture program is competency and perhaps even expertise in the design and management of stormwater. And so when we think about how to site, how to deploy renewable energy technology, whether it's solar panels like this, whether it's a transmission line connecting it to a grid or to a community scale sort of co-op, or whether it's the siting of something like a battery farm to store power when it's not needed from a site like this. These are all things that at the moment are entirely in the domain of energy systems engineers. And if we're going to do this well, we're going to have to make these things experientially and visually much more interesting and charismatic for folks to become aligned with. And that's absolutely the domain of landscape architects and architects. And, again, if we're just thinking about the build out of wind only as a way to power the United States, it's not something we would actually do or even want to do. But again, we're talking about huge, huge swaths of land that are required to build this for lots of reasons that are probably obvious. Renewable energy is much less dense than fossil fuels. And so you need much more surface area to generate the same degree of power that you would need to power, a country like the US on coal and gas with wind and solar and perhaps advanced nuclear. I'm going to turn that down a little bit. So I mentioned Iceland at the beginning. This is here just outside of the geothermal zone that I had that sort of initial picture of. This is at something called the ON geothermal power plant. It's now the second largest. When it was built, it was the largest geothermal power plant in the world. The largest one is now in China. But it's also the site of something called the Orca and soon to be Mammoth carbon dioxide removal facilities, which are the first commercially viable direct air capture operations in the world. What that means is basically they're using excess geothermal and hydroelectric power in this particular part of Iceland to power what amounts to a giant fan. It looks like you'll see some more pictures of it as we go. But it's this, very bizarre, very industrial form of technology that forces air through scrubbers to capture CO2 and then injects it into deep wells in the ground where it's then mineralized back into carbonate and other forms of rock, essentially. And when it comes to questions of renewable energy, energy democracy, climate justice, again, we are on these questions of how does this stuff get cited at scale in a way that is beautiful and democratic and just, where we were on questions, similar questions when it came to stormwater management 30 and 40 years ago. And so with that in mind, we can start to talk about how we might think about this challenge through the various sites that are bound up in the energy transition, from the mine to the manufacturing center, to the stockpiling of rare earth elements and critical minerals, to their physical deployment in the landscape to power our homes and cars and schools and buses, to their end cycle when they're considered waste or discard and are often sent to other parts of the world where informal economies exist around them. And you're looking here at a sort of relatively quick and loose rendering of the supply chain of lithium-ion battery spread across the world. Probably not a huge surprise to you all as, they're your neighbors, but Australia, China, and then also Canada are sort of the global powers when it comes to mining and extraction activity. The US is very quickly trying to ramp up its to meet similar targets. And if we look at the sort of geography of active and speculative rare earth element mining and critical mineral mining around the world, we can see, even though those are sort of the 3, perhaps 4, perhaps 5 powers, if we include certain countries in the European Union, Portugal, Spain, Germany, France in particular are very active when it comes to building out their extraction activities as part of the energy transition. These are all the sites where all of this stuff is located. If you want solar panels, if you want wind turbines, if you want supercomputers, if you want cloud computing, if you want any of the things that are required to digitize and then power the world through renewable energy, you have to pull stuff out of the ground in at least some of these places. And, probably, again, not a huge surprise to most of the folks on this call. Nations like the US, where these end-use technologies from extraction often go, tend to take them from places that are intentionally underdeveloped. And so some of the densest deposits of rare earth elements in the world are in Bayan Obo in Inner Mongolia, China, and also in South Greenland, in a town called Narsaq, which is town of about 1,700, mostly Inuit people living in relative isolation there in the south of Greenland. And, you know, as Canada, as Australia, as China continue their push to try and own and capture and control as much of the rare earth and critical mineral supply chain as they can, the US and European Union are embarking on their own efforts to catch up in a sense. And so this has been one of the signature sort of achievements, if we want to call it that, of the Biden administration, has been to become a new or nascent mining power and renewable energy development power as a result of some of the work here that my colleague Diaria Francos is highlighting for us. And I won't read all of this, but she's writing about lithium, and obviously lithium-ion batteries are considered sort of the state of the art in terms of renewable energy technology for storage. It's not clear if that will always be true because there are lots of substitution questions that we haven't sorted out yet. But she's writing here about, you know, a really important question in her own research about how we think about the global supply of lithium. So she's writing, however, lithium supply is not an objective parameter, but a spatially and temporally dynamic relationship between deposits, scientific knowledge, technological innovations, and public policy. And what she's really saying here is that, you know, the question that most imperial powers like the US, Australia, and others ask themselves when it comes to an element like lithium is not how much of it do we need, it's how much of it exists and how do we own as much of it as possible. And what Thea and others in this field are asking us to consider is a question of how much we actually need. How do we control demand as a way of controlling the supply of and the development of extraction activities in resource communities throughout the global south, many of which have very complicated and sort of sordid neocolonial relationships to places like the US and Australia and others. And again, I think when we, you know, when we look back on the Biden administration in 20, 25, 30 years, I don't think we'll think of him as a climate president. I think we will think of him as a mining president. That's what his sort of climate bills, the IRA, the IAJA, the Infrastructure and Inflation Reduction Acts have been about. And it's all a larger part of this effort to onshore the entire supply chain of the renewable energy system from the mine to the waste site and everything in between within the US in this case. And again, I won't go through all of this, but Martin Arboleda is writing about this in a sense, kind of predicting it 4 or 5 years ago now in his book, A Planetary Mine, talking about many of the mines that were decommissioned as coal was phased out in places like Appalachia, in the Ruhr Valley in Germany and certain parts of China that are now being reopened because they also happen to be sites of incredibly dense rare earth and critical mineral deposits. And if you haven't been to Inner Mongolia, China, because I'm not sure why you would, to see Bayanova, the mining district there, the largest one in the world, about 85% of all rare earth elements and critical minerals in the world move through this site at some point, either because they're taken out of the ground here, or because they're processed here, or because they're stockpiled here, or all of the above. The Biden administration is now in the process of building out a competitor facility to this in Texas. It'll be the first one in the US. The groundbreaking happened earlier this year. It's expected to be online in 2026, and it's going to reshape the sort of global flow of these materials if it's successful. And another colleague of mine, Jesse Jenkins, who is just up the road from me at Princeton at the Edlinger Center, which is their kind of energy policy research institute, has begun to think about scenarios and to develop scenarios for how the build out of the entire renewable energy system in the US could actually come together. And you're seeing here a mix of different kinds of generation. You can see wind and utility scale solar projects there in the blue and sort of orange. He's starting to forecast where transmission corridors, new transmission corridors can and should be built. This is all, you know, this is a very complicated model he and his colleagues have produced here that are taking in all kinds of different geophysical and cultural and economic constraints. So trying, you know, really closely to estimate with as much realism as possible where we can expect these projects to be developed. And in many cases, actually, this particular report, which is called Net Zero America, has been considered the kind of playbook for the Biden administration as they begin the implementation of their various bills and executive actions that were passed beginning in 2021 and kind of going forward. And if we just look for a second at the kind of amount, the sort of scope and scale of landscape transformation that we're talking about here, you know, this is starting to give us a sense of how much, in terms of gigawatt power, new gigawatt power is going to come online state by state in the US. You can see, unsurprisingly, Texas, California, Florida as huge players when it comes to solar, Missouri, Nebraska, North Dakota, lots of others when it comes to wind power. But perhaps the more interesting sort of tidbit from that particular report for us in landscape is just looking at the amount of land area that's going to be required for these kinds of transformations. And so if we just take a state like Missouri, we're talking about somewhere on the order of 25 to 30% of all land in the state of Missouri, which is a relatively large state, much of which is crop or forest land, having to be converted to solar and wind power just to meet the sort of bare minimum targets that Jesse and his colleagues have set forward for us. So we are getting into this conversation in one of the most sort of incredible and stilted land rushes, land competitions for space that we've seen in any of our lifetimes. The fight for what a parcel's future, whether it's to produce new energy, whether it's a site of extraction, whether it's a site of new housing, whether it's a site of public and open space, whether it's a site of stormwater management, whether it's one of the many different things we all need to survive and thrive in this world. The competition for that space will never be greater than it will be for the next 30 some odd years. And this is part of why the Biden administration has begun to push so hard to develop so many of these particular, basically every node along the renewable energy supply chain in the United States. So you're looking here at the beginning of what's being called the Nevada Lithium Project. This is supposed to be a means for the U.S. to secure a reliable and in perpetuity flow of lithium for all battery development and perhaps commercial sale around the world and export over the next 50 some odd years. Groundbreaking for this was about a year ago, and it's being developed in kind of the Four Corners area of the U.S. And so if we think about, this will be a little bit of a refresher for those of you who had, I don't know, the fortune or misfortune of meeting me when I was there a few years ago, but a quick little refresher on a bit of that work, just to give you a sense of, how does this post-carbon futures energy transition work connect to something like a Green New Deal? And the answer to that is, there are many ways it can. But if we think about what the GND actually is, as opposed to what it's often been mythologized to be, and mythologized to be, at least in the US, is that it's a plan to end all air travel, to like ban hamburgers, to ban red meat, to like destroy rural America. It's none of those things. But what it actually is it's a wholly unique plan of the American experience. And that it actually attempts to fuse real science-based technocratic demands for decarbonization with a real sort of materialist agenda around job creation for workers, in particular for union jobs. And to target all of the investments as much as possible in areas of historic and ongoing disinvestment, what we might call frontline communities. We've never had a climate plan in this country that's attempted to do more than one of these things. And really, we've never had a climate plan in this country that's attempted to do any of these things in any real measure. It's also unique in that, as I mentioned kind of just a moment ago, it's the only climate plan ever introduced in this country that's actually indexed to the IPCC's latest science. So it's the only one that has targets that are keyed into the different emissions pathway scenarios that the IPCC has laid out for us. Let me go back for 1 second. If we think back to some of the previous iterations of climate legislation in the US, the most obvious ones are going to be Waxman-Markey, which was our cap and trade proposal back in 2010. Did not get out of the Senate, but even if it had, would have only kept us at around 4.5 degrees of warming, but not have created a single job. And if we look at the IRA, President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, there's essentially no decarbonization baked into that when we look at the net of what that particular bill will do. It's gonna juice up a bunch of new renewable energy deployment, as it also juices up a bunch of new extraction activity for oil and gas. And we're actually building some of the first new coal and gas plants in this country in the last 30 years, or excuse me, last 25 years, because of the IRA in a way. It's also unique in that it's the only plan put forward in the last 100 years, really since the New Deal, that is predicated on a multiracial working class base to push it through. And then the last thing I'll say, or one of the last things I'll say, is that it's very much an instrumental built environment program. It's a climate policy that you can touch where you live, where you work, if you have kids, where they go to school. And that it's now also at this point being tested and prototyped by a number of different mayors, city council members, and state legislators, who I often have the real luck or fortune of getting to work with. So Michelle Wu in Boston, Nithya Raman in Los Angeles, and then actually my neighbor here in Philadelphia, Nikhil Sabal, as well as a number of different members of Congress. And I won't talk too much about that work, but if folks have questions about it, I'm happy to get into it. And then, as we start to think about, what the Green New Deal is asking for, it's the basically full build out of a just and decarbonized and jobs forward energy system by the middle of the century, if not earlier. with this kind of larger sort of push for this massive deployment of all forms of renewable energy technology within the United States, there are a bunch of different beacons that we might think about as ways to kind of guide us down this path. And for me, one of the big pushes for putting this book together was to look around and realize, when people ask me, what does the world look like that Green New Dealers, that climate justice advocates, that just transition advocates say they want to build look like? And that's often the hardest question to answer because we don't have very many good projects in that way, or in that world, particularly in the US, where we haven't really built anything like what we're going to look at here in quite a long time. And so you're getting a quick little image here of the Ningxia Agrivoltaics project in China. I'll say a little bit more about this as we go, but if you don't know this project, this is considered a pilot scale project for them. It's about 1,500 hectares in the Ningxia province, which is right at the edge of the sort of Gobi creeping into northwest China. It's imagined as kind of a triple or sort of a triumvirate of goals in one project. So you're getting solar energy production here, obviously with the solar panels. You're getting fruit production here through berries, as part of the sort of agricultural operation. That's where you get agrivoltaics from, agriculture and photovoltaics. And then it's also being treated as a way to stop or slow desertification and the spread of the Gobi into the rest of China. And it's been so successful, actually, this project was built about 10 years ago, that they're planning and getting ready to build a project that's about 100 times the scale of this. So it's going to cover much of the Ningxia and some of its surrounding Hebei and other provinces in northwest China as we go. And so, this was a project that came to me a few years ago from some friends who were doing fieldwork in the area, and quickly became kind of a way for me to begin to formulate some questions that the book would be sort of organized around. And these are the big ones. There are lots of other ones I won't really get into in this talk, but at the core of the book are sort of three questions that now 33 or so projects around the world are speaking to in different ways, and that a bunch of colleagues and other folks are writing about in different ways. And those are, initially from an historical perspective, what can we learn from prior eras of state-led transformation of the built environment as this energy transition unfolds? So certainly the New Deal is part of that. So is the Marshall Plan in Europe, and so are some other sort of cognate plans in Latin America and Southeast Asia that I'll talk about in a bit too. And second, if we think domestically for a bit, just about the US, or really you can think about this in any context, but I'm thinking about it in the context of the US. How do we start to think through the tensions between this need for expedience to do a lot of stuff really quickly and really well with our hopeful desire to practice democracy and not to just steamroll people? And then lastly, if we widen our frame a bit and think about, the world as kind of an interconnected set of systems, what might it mean for the rest of the world if the West in particular continues down the pathway it's on now, which is the most resource intensive pathway for an energy transition that anyone could imagine? Now, there are lots of, one of the fun things about putting this book together was that I got to ask a bunch of really smart people, about 150 or so in all, for nominations for a project. And I gave them a set of criteria about scale, about, who really was involved in its construction, about how its benefits are distributed, controlled, and managed, and so on. And I put a real emphasis on projects that are not sort of core to the designer's lexicon today. So I didn't want to build a book around a bunch of projects that people already know that get referenced that perhaps are a little less applicable to questions of the 21st century just transition than they might have been in the 20th century when climate change began to be discussed, in sort of explicit terms in public. And so this is a really quick little run through of a few of them. You're seeing 9. I'm going to take you through a bunch more, but there's the Ningxia Agrivoltaics project in China in the top left. Again, that's an effort to both slow desertification, to generate renewable energy, and to basically produce a bunch of commercially viable cropland, goji berries, essentially. In the center there, actually in the center, the top end and the middle are the 2-day geothermal plant, which is in the Fort Nelson province of British Columbia. And then in the middle is the Watena-Kaniep transmission corridor, which is the corridor I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. The actual energy source here is less interesting than the model for its implementation. One of the ways that Canada is thinking about the implementation phase of its Truth and Reconciliation process is by requiring that all federally funded infrastructure and energy projects be owned in whole, or at least in majority, by First Nations. And so both of these projects are owned 100% by either a single tribe in the case of Tudeka, or by a consortium of tribes in the case of Watinakanea. And this is a way for them to not only control and lower the cost of their own energy system, but to actually generate revenue that could be reinvested in all forms of community development in lots of ways that can be done autonomously outside the scope of the rest of the sort of Canadian government apparatus. In the top right is the Orca carbon dioxide removal plant that I mentioned earlier. In the sort of middle left there is a quick little image of a field coming back in the Zapatista Milpa system of Chilpa, Mexico. This is an incredible thousands-year-old agroecology project that now spans much of South and Central Mexico. It's taken many forms over the years, but has now become this incredible instrument of not only community and resistance building and power building, but also for creating the most genetically diverse food system in the entire world, and also one of the most biodiverse parts of the world in Central Mexico. All the way to the right, in the middle there, is a quick little image of a project in Germany, part of their international Bachstellung. And the project that often gets sort of highlighted from the IDA is Emscher Landscape Park, and that project is in this book. But this is First Pukler. This is a very different kind of project. It's also dealing with a resource community, also trying to think about ways not only to sort of remediate all of the toxic landscapes left behind by coal mining and coal power plant operation in the area, but also to build out an entirely new institutional and industrial capacity in the area. So the development of vocational and higher education institutions and all manner of sort of workforce training that goes along with it in the area. And then in the sort of bottom here, we're getting into a couple of sort of grassroots-driven resistance projects to different kinds of extraction. In the bottom left, you're seeing the Longisun logging resistance and sort of water protectors of Borneo. In the center, you're seeing Uranium Namik, which means uranium no thanks in Greenlandic. These are a group of Inuit activists who've been mobilized off and on over the last half century to halt uranium mining in the region, often by Danish or US government sort of agencies. And then in the bottom right, you're seeing Raccoon Mountain, which is one of the first and the largest capacity in the US pumped storage power plants. And what that basically means is this is an old mine that was converted to a reservoir. It runs along a river. And when there are times of sort of excess energy generation, so the wind is blowing so consistently that the relatively sparse population of Appalachia and Eastern Tennessee can't use it all. They use that excess power to pump water uphill. And then when the wind dies down and there's not enough to power those same homes, they release it and it spins turbines the way a hydroelectric power plant would. So again, 33 projects in 5 categories. These categories might get some slight changes in terms of what I'm calling them, but this is the gist of them. There's one here that's really about kind of urbanism and social housing. So how do we think about, the housing sector as a place to both target for all kinds of decarbonization and justice forward investments? There's a collection of projects that are about sort of landscape as infrastructure and as a tool of carbon management that are, all over the world. There's a third category of projects there that are really about sort of what the landscapes of the renewable energy system could or perhaps should look like and how they might work. Again, from all over the world. And then there are a couple of categories at the end there that are about, they're really about large scale landscape transformation, but one is a collection of projects in which that transformation is really being driven by the state through statecraft. And another is coming through social movements like the Milpa system in Mexico that I mentioned. And I won't spend a ton of time on these because I know we're close, and I don't want to halt Matthew from peppering me with questions. But we're looking here really quickly at Grand Park social housing in the Bordeaux region of France. So if anyone here is off to Paris soon for the Olympics, this is a very, very, very quick train ride. Bordeaux is a very lovely place to go visit for lots of reasons. This is a project that has become famous in recent years and has become well loved in architecture in recent years, but was reviled for a long time by architects, really until the folks who created it, Lacaton and Vassal, won the Pritzker and were kind of reimagined by their colleagues in different ways than they were before they won. This project's remarkable for all kinds of reasons, but the quick one that I'll say is just this is was old, relatively dilapidated social housing in the Bordeaux region of France. And when they were commissioned to take on this project, there were all kinds of questions about what might happen here. Should we demolish the site and start over? Should we move everyone off and then do some really deep renovations and then hope they're still around to come back when we're done? And what the architects decided to do was to create a strategy that would be minimally invasive, which involved essentially doing some quick renovation work in each unit and then actually building cantilevered balconies and extra space onto each unit so that everyone had both more space and they could live in their unit while it was being renovated. So you had basically no one forced to leave this particular social housing tower during this massive new investment that had not happened in 50 some odd years there. And then being able to enjoy this kind of incredible space you see in the bottom right there at the end of its construction. I mentioned First Pupler earlier. This is a quick little site map and a few images from that, like Emscher Park and like many of the IBA programs in Germany. It's hard to do this one justice in a single slide. There are 350 some odd individual projects here. But what these little islands are attempting to do here is to take the most polluted, most underinvested, most lacking in terms of institutional industrial capacity zones of the region and target as much state or federal or local investment and private investment into them as possible. Sometimes it was about remediation, but often it was really about trying to generate both tourism and industrial activity on the site. Again, that would be low or no carbon in its emissions. If we peek again at Iceland, I mentioned this plant a couple of times. What you're seeing on the left is really a quick little map of Iceland's geothermal zone running from kind of southwest to northeast through the center of the country. That kind of large red plus that you see there is the ON geothermal plant that you can see in the top right there. And then at the bottom right, that's a part of the Orca carbon dioxide removal plant that I mentioned, or direct air capture plant. And it's one of the most bizarre technologies you could imagine. It's just a very large fan system and scrubber where air is forced through it at a kind of rapid pace. And then the carbon is essentially stuck to the vents and then in deep well injected into deep wells that would have been either geothermal drilling zones. In the case of Iceland, they could be oil and gas extraction, wells in other contexts. But it's being used there as kind of the first place where we've really piloted this particular kind of technology at this scale and to become commercially viable. And it's been so successful that Iceland is now building a much larger and more advanced version, or Climeworks in Iceland, is building a much larger, more advanced version called Mammoth that I believe construction just finished about a month ago. It should come online sometime this summer. And then, I could talk about the rest of these projects forever. Obviously, I'm not going to do that unless folks have a lot of questions. But to give you a really quick sense of like the survey of images or survey of projects that are here. In the top left here is a project called Repurpose Savannah. This is a collective of queer and non-binary and women sort of builders and building trades unions workers in Savannah, Georgia and surrounding environs. Who are doing exactly what you would imagine when you see this picture. They're involved in the demolition of abandoned and condemned housing, and then the creation of a really incredible materials library that's now being used for upgrading, renovating, and building new housing in the region. And when the map for that project is ready, it's pretty incredible. You can see this small little hub with a material library and this like constellation of sites they've impacted over the last 10 years alone. In the center there at the top is Cantino Say, in Brazil, one of the only sort of informal social housing by right projects really in the world that is now being identified as a site for investments, not only in basic infrastructure, but also deep energy retrofits in an informal housing setting, which is pretty exciting to think about. In the top right there is Fußbad, also in Germany, which was really, for them, one of the sort of transformative public space project about cleaning up a river, creating this incredible amenity. This was a river so toxic people wouldn't go near it because of the smell and because of the site. And now is a place where people are able to a few times a year actually go swim. In the center left there, you're looking at kayakers at Raccoon Mountain, the kind of pump storage hydro plant I mentioned earlier. I won't say too much more about it. In the center there, you're looking at the Blackfoot Ecological Restoration Project. This is kind of the northern tip of the Great Plains of North America that stretches from kind of central Canada down to Oklahoma and kind of the panhandle of Texas. This is the only part of that sort of large, very large continental scale landscape system that is completely owned and being restored entirely by its indigenous peoples and population. And then on the center right there, you're seeing again one of the landmarks of First Pupler, the kind of IBA project in Germany I've mentioned a couple times. In the bottom left there, you're seeing again one of the milpas in Chiapas, Mexico, where all forms of basically the entire diet of Oaxaca is able to be grown on a very small plot, whether it's maize, whether it's beans, whether it's rice, whether it's other crops. In the sort of bottom center there, you're seeing again another image of the Tudeka geothermal plant in British Columbia in Canada. And then in the bottom right, you're seeing a quick little image there of Cuba's Organopanicos system, which is was an invention of theirs that came during the embargo when they had to be able to secure their entire food system without having to import anything. And so you have this collection of sites, small and large and medium and everything in between, that are owned, managed, operated by residents in the buildings you see around them. And it's incredible sort of organic agroecological project that doesn't really exist in this kind of form or scale anywhere else in the world. And when we start to put all these things on a silly little map like this, we can see kind of where the spread of these things is starting to go. And there's like any other project, I think, where I'm getting asked to curate 150, 200, 300 nominations down to 33. There's going to be a little bias in there, so there are probably more American projects than there should be in this collection. But as I mentioned, kind of getting started, almost all of the most interesting beacons are outside of the US and really outside of North America. And I think these are interesting for all kinds of reasons, but one is just that, in our field, much of the infrastructure that we live with today that we're trying to find ways to either unbuild or replace with much of this renewable energy was built by the same mega firms who are now trying to line up for the firms that built our pipelines, that built our refineries, that built our prisons are now lining up to try and ask for money to build our climate justice projects. And you can imagine how those conversations go in frontline communities. When someone who built, the Pima County, Sheriff's Correctional Institute here, which is an AECOM project. When someone builds the Abu Dhabi National Oil Headquarters project, which is HOK. When someone builds what's functionally an eco-apartheid project, again, in the UAE, how that's received by some of their community members when they also try to come in a few years later, talking about climate justice in ways that don't always feel credible to some of their community members. And then I'll leave us here and invite Matthew to kind of ask me to shut up for a minute so he can ask questions. But this is from one of my friends and colleagues I get to do some work with occasionally, Olufemi Taiwo, who's just down the road from me in Washington, D.C., who somehow writes a book like every 8 months. I don't really understand how his life works to be able to do that, but he does it regularly. And this is the opening to one of his books. I think the one that I've found the most useful for this particular project, called Reconsidering Reparations, where he's really asking some questions about what international climate policy might have to say about the historic and ongoing imbalance between the global North and South. And Femi opens the book with this passage, that injustice and oppression are global in scale. Why? Because transatlantic slavery and colonialism built the world that we live in. And slavery and colonialism were unjust and oppressive. If we want reparations, we should be thinking more broadly about how to remake the world system. And that's what any conversation about a post-carbon future or a just transition or a Green New Deal sort of demands. And so with that, I'll stop talking, at least for a little while, and thanks for hanging out with me.
Thanks very much, Billy. That's really fantastic. Unbelievable scope and energy from you and your work. So I've just got so everyone, please. I'm sure there's lots of questions. To put them in the Q&A, and I'll read some out. I've also got a few questions, but perhaps we'll start with Nick Pearson. And so Nick asks, now that we're past peak oil, what is your view that we won't have enough fossil fuel to build all the clean energy infrastructure to sustain us in the past, sustain us in the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there are lots of ways to think about this question. I think, one is to really, I think, well, first like to question whether or not we think we're actually past peak oil, because peak oil is a concept that's been floated off and on for 35 odd years now. And every time we're told we've reached that point, magically some new form of technology, some new stream of federal or state or local subsidy is created that makes it possible to unlock more oil and gas reserves. Peak oil really is trying to tell us that not that we're out of oil and gas or we've reached a point where we're not going to be able to recover more than we've recovered now. It's telling us that what's there in what are called reserves can no longer be accessed at the same level because the technology, the financing, whatever it might be, does not allow us to do so. And I say all that because, every time we think we've reached a point where, the returns are diminishing, the technology is maxed out in terms of what we can get to or what we can unlock, something new is developed or created in order to support the continued extraction of oil and gas. And so I hope you're right that we have reached peak oil, but I'm not so sure, actually. I think if we assume that's the case, I think we can kind of set aside the other question about whether or not we have enough fossil fuels to build the energy infrastructure. But if we entertain it for a second, I think we can also just look at how the fossil fuel industry is planning for the energy transition. They know, and they've said so publicly, they'll obviously say so privately, and you can look at you can jump on a quarterly earnings call if you would like to, which is the thing I do from time to time, because I like to hear what they have to say about, what their forecasts are. Their long-term plan isn't to continue extraction activity. They know that that day is coming to an end, whether it's in 10 years, whether it's in 100 years, whether it's in 300 years. They obviously have their preferences for that, but I think they know that time is running out. And so their plan is actually less about the continued production of fossil fuels for power, for electricity, although they'll continue to sort of, I think, hold on to the hope that they can be the sole provider of aviation and maritime fuel, which are the two hardest transportation sort of fuel challenges to solve. But what they're actually going to try to do instead is just continue to make everything that we all wear and eat out of and drink out of petrochemicals. That's the plan for the fossil fuel industry. It's not to think about how do we keep people hooked on oil and gas for fuel forever, although I think they would love that. It's just not going to happen. Their plan for survival is to make sure that petrochemicals and the creation of plastics and single-use plastics go on forever. And that's actually like where there's real work still to be done to figure out what alternatives are from a technological perspective. How to keep more oil and gas in the ground is a purely political problem at this point.
Great. Yeah. Very, very interesting answer and interesting kind of direction. So another kind of question. This is from Ethan. Thanks, Billy. What are some of the tools that landscape architects will need to cultivate to engage in the design of these new typological projects that you have identified?
Yeah, this is a question I'm really glad you asked, because it's something I think I zipped through in the presentation. But if you think back for just a moment, I mentioned a couple of times, I think about landscape architecture and its relationship to renewable energy today being kind of where our field was when it comes to stormwater management 30, 40 years ago, depending on the context. When landscape architecture got into the stormwater management sort of area in the 80s and 90s, and certainly increasingly so in the 21st century, it was a really difficult slog, because that's a domain area that was essentially owned by civil engineers. They weren't particularly interested in the way we might think about alternative forms of stormwater management. It was not unlike traffic engineering. It was about conveying as much water as quickly as possible out of an area that might, be considered a high flood risk or a hazard or whatever it might be. And so when you think about the sort of introduction of urban green infrastructure as a tool of stormwater management, which is only really just beginning to kind of occur at a meaningful scale, at least in the United States and in Europe and in other parts of the world. that's the result of 30 plus years of effort in the academy and in the professions to build up new forms of technical expertise that would allow landscape architects to be involved in the design, the detailing, the siting, and the operation and management of these forms of sort of stormwater management control. And that's kind of where we are when it comes to renewable energy. We actually don't know, we don't have a lot of ideas about how to site projects better in ways that do something besides maximize energy generation optimization. So when you think about, the design standards today for speccing photovoltaic installation, if it's utility scale or community scale, for a wind farm, for a battery farm, for a transmission corridor, whatever it might be, all these different components of the renewable energy system. All those standards are set by essentially civil engineers and energy systems engineers, occasionally land use planners. None of that work is done by landscape architects or architects, at least like in terms of setting standards. So we might apply those standards to a project we're on a team for. But those projects are all designed to maximize energy output or energy generation, excuse me, which makes some sense if you're an engineer. But if we understand that the single biggest bottleneck to building more of these systems isn't financial, like the money is there to do this in many places. It isn't technological. We can always make better wind turbines. We can always make better solar photovoltaics. We can always make better batteries and so on. We can always make better cloud computing or data centers. But we have enough of what we sort of need in that area to do much of the work that lays in front of us. The biggest challenges are around local opposition to having to look at and live with and deal with these systems. And for understandable reasons, they're industrial scale technology. They're not, I enjoy, like when I travel, I love to go visit these sites. So when I'm in Greenland, I like to hike the hydroelectric dams because I'm a weirdo. But not everybody likes to do that. And so we have to think about ways to make these projects beautiful, engaging, experientially rich, and complex for people. We have to find ways for people to see themselves, their lives, their communities, and the build out of this renewable energy system. And there are lots of parts of the world that do this much better than the US. New Zealand is among them. And so thinking about ways to standardize the specification of, how we want to lay out a solar farm, how we want to lay out a wind farm, how we want to lay out a transmission corridor, how we want to develop a battery farm. Those are all really critical questions that we don't have answers to in our field. And so, if I were the editor of a book series, and I were thinking about a new book to commission, the first thing on my list would be a sort of boring graphic standards and construction standards book about how to do that well in ways that optimize other factors besides just energy generation or storage, that optimize people's experience with these bits of technology so that we can build enough power to build as much of this stuff as fast as we can. Because the more of these things that we build that people hate, the harder it is to build the next one.
Great. Yep. Very thought-provoking. I guess another kind of follow-up kind of question to that, and maybe sort of digging a little bit deeper. So thinking about actually landscape practice itself and how and the sort of model of landscape practice, I guess we can maybe see there's been maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago, landscape architects were mostly employed by state agencies and working on often large-scale infrastructure projects, large-scale social projects, and that's as we know, it's sort of kind of transitioned into private. Now the model is mostly a private practice model. What do you think the implication of the sort of work that you're talking about is for the way we practice as landscape architects?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think if I'm not running a firm for lots of reasons, but if I were, and we're trying to balance the very real and short-term need to meet payroll and keep lights on and keep folks who you've invested in the office with a desire to be ready and well positioned to take advantage of all of the medium term and in some cases short-term projects that are going to come for the renewable energy system. That's like where I would be steering people. I'd be thinking about, like, for me, and again, this is in the US context, almost all of this work is coming through contracts, right? So there's money coming from the federal government or maybe the state government. It's not going, projects aren't being designed, built, managed by state agency employees. They're being sent to large firms who become general contractors or subcontractors on a large project. And so in the same way that we saw, really beginning in the 2010s and continuing into the present day, a bunch of firms kind of scrambling to position themselves for the flood of climate resilience money that would come, right? For coastal adaptation work, for disaster recovery work, for all kinds of sort of water engineering related challenges. That's where practice is beginning to do a little bit of this work and has a lot more room to kind of maneuver, to think about, if we can't outcompete a big or a one architecture or Escape or whoever it might be for the next, round of coastal resilience projects, how do we make ourselves indispensable to the construction of the next renewable energy project, of the next large landscape conservation or restoration project that is really organized around carbon sequestration and management, for the deployment of something like an orca or a mammoth in New Zealand or in the US or whatever it might be. And so for practice, I think it's about trying to develop the folks you have and hire new folks into the office who have a skill set that's going to make you as competitive as possible for all of those renewable energy and carbon management projects that are coming. In some cases, they're here, but in most cases, they will be here in the next 5 years. And the firms that have people in-house that are ready to sort of run on those when those contracts or RFPs become available are going to be the ones who benefit the most from it. And I think the danger in the US, just because of the way we tend to handle procurement for large federal contracts, like let's just say the construction of a utility scale kind of wind farm or solar farm in Texas, it's going to go to one of the 3 to 5 mega firm on-call contractors that we already have, who again have this long sort of history and in some cases present of building some of the worst, and most immiserative projects that humanity has ever seen. And we'll face real challenges when it comes to getting community buy-in and engagement if they're the ones that are tasked with now building a just transition. And so, yeah, I mean, I think if it were me, I'd be thinking about ways to position my practice to take advantage of this flood of contracts that is coming. May not be here like everywhere yet, but it's going to be here this decade. And the folks, I think we all have, like in the academy, we have work to do to better prepare students to do that kind of work. And in practice, there's work to be done to sort of build that plank of expertise in their portfolio alongside coastal resilience, alongside, institutional or campus planning, whatever it might be. This is the next plank, I think, for landscape architects to develop in their office settings.
Yeah, it's very, very true. I mean, I've got a million questions, but there's 65 participants, so please put some questions in, because this is a great opportunity to talk to very important and perceptive thinker about landscapes. I guess while we're waiting, perhaps, and this is maybe more kind of a general kind of question. So and then I guess keep connecting up decarbonizing with or perhaps climate adaptation. So big issue for a lot of the world is perhaps managed retreat. We're going to have to leave certain kind of areas. We're going to have to and build new cities. Going to have to build new towns. What's your thinking or thoughts around how are we going to address that through this decarbonizing kind of lens? Are we going to be using offsetting? There's obviously a lot of critique about that. What are your thoughts about that sort of the energy requirements of these new towns, these new cities that we're going to have to build?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on kind of where, context matters a lot in this is really what I'm trying to say, I think. And if we're talking about on the new town side of it, I think actually it's a bit easier maybe than it seems, because you're talking about building an entirely new development from scratch and not having to deal in some cases with kind of the legacy of poorly built or non-optimized for carbon related or social justice related reasons, cities that are going to be essentially abandoned as sea levels rise. But I think the challenge for us is similar to the one I mentioned for building out the kind of standard language for how to deploy renewable energy technology in a way that optimizes something besides just power generation or storage. And by that I mean there's a real need to think about how we begin to co-locate both activities we might loosely broadly think about as adaptation activities or resilience activities with mitigation or energy systems activities. There are very few, I know because we scoured kind of the world for a couple of years looking for projects like this for the book. There are just vanishingly few places that have even attempted it. No one has really done it particularly well. And in the cases where you could make the argument perhaps that they have, and I'm thinking of, there are a couple of projects in the book I didn't mention that do a little bit of this. One is in Greensburg, Kansas, which is a state in the United States. It's a place that was completely leveled by an EF5 tornado in 2007 or 2008. And then was essentially rebuilt in mostly the same area, a little bit of a difference, using, at the time, LEED Platinum certification for every building. And now it's become a kind of site of experimentation for the National Renewable Energy Lab, which is kind of the primary research and innovation and development lab for clean energy in the US, to begin rapidly decarbonizing it. So it's one of the greenest, lowest carbon towns in the world, particularly in the US, and it's the result of kind of a tragic devastation event, not unlike one you would expect to find in kind of a coastal town facing storm surge or other flooding related risks. And the other, which is also kind of like a tragic-ish kind of story, is Kiribati, which has on the books at least, its Migration with Dignity plan, which is a plan for the eventual inundation of that chain of South Pacific islands. And part of that plan is about training up a bunch of its current residents, sending them out to particular parts of the world where their skills are going to be in high demand, allowing for them to send remittances back to Kiribati to families to sort of sustain them while they're gone, and then building up these kind of first generation immigrant communities in Australia, in Malaysia, in New Zealand, in another part of kind of the Pacific Basin, where their people can go when their islands no longer exist. And neither of those projects really deal with the initial phase or the loss that comes from those kinds of events that tend to trigger a mass rebuilding or managed retreat sort of effort. There are very few versions of that are proactive. They're almost all things that get planned or developed and then implemented after a major catastrophic event like that, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a long way around to saying, I don't think we have very many. We don't have a lot of thinking yet on how to co-locate, adaptation and resilience work with carbon mitigation and management work. And the sooner we start to put those things together, the easier it is to solve some of those problems I sort of mentioned earlier around competition for space. If we're trying to do all of these things at the same time in all of these different places, the only way we're going to be able to do all the things we want is if we start doing a lot of things in the same place.
Yeah. Absolutely. We are probably running out of time, but there's some more really interesting questions. So I think we'll just keep going if people don't mind. So, and you're okay, Billy? We can keep.
Yeah, I've got like another 10 minutes or so.
10 minutes, brilliant. Yeah. So Daniel McEwen, you spoke on the tension of some of the big outfits who are perpetrators of some of the destructive systems we have become reliant on. Any advice on to how, as a profession, we can help avoid the greenwashing that these companies are adopting, as you mentioned, to keep their business offerings growing, but appear to have a green, inverted commas, green conscience?
Yeah, I mean, if I knew the answer to this, I don't know what I would be doing, but it might be something else. Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't know what the right way to do this is, because I have lots of friends and former students and colleagues who work in many of these places, and they're all yearning to do good. They're in this field, they're at those offices because they want to be able to build projects that make the world better. And because so many of these firms have made decisions over the years to just grow infinitely, and this is obviously the case for like an AECOM, but lots of other firms we could talk about. Those firms have put themselves in a position where they have to take projects like that because they've ballooned into such a state that if they don't take, every contract that gets offered to them, they do have to start thinking about closing offices, laying off workers, furloughing people, all of that kind of stuff. And so I want to be sensitive to that because those are real people whose lives and livelihoods matter. But I'm not interested in pushing them out of the field or pushing those firms out of the field. I think, this is not unlike the way that, folks in New Zealand or Australia or Canada, or to a much lesser extent, the US, have started to think about what it means to actually reconcile with First Nations and, sort of indigenous peoples who've been at the center of oppression and immiseration in these places for a very long time. And, very different scale of what we're talking about for these firms, but for them to be able to come to the table and be trusted and good actors in the build out of something like a just transition, it's going to require them to reckon with, certainly internally, but also probably publicly, with all the things they've done to the world, and some of which are good, many of which are not. And until they're willing to do that, I'm interested in paying attention to other firms. I'm not going to use my time or energy to kind of go after folks who I don't think should be part of this conversation.
Yeah. Just a couple more questions. Got a really interesting one from Alan Titchener. Kira, Billy, interested in the Blackfoot project you identified. What was the process used in engaging with First Nation and delegating control of the project to them?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's so much literature on this project out there now, and just from the last couple of years, that I'd encourage you to just, jump onto Google Scholar and start poking around. But the short version of it is, Blackfeet peoples, like many other indigenous people, who've lived in kind of a savanna or grassland or prairie sort of condition, developed over, centuries, millennia in some cases, very sophisticated methods of dealing with fire and growth and understory and forestry and all kinds of other things that we've now sort of replaced with very rationalized and technocratic methods in the West. And that particular project is interesting in part because it's one of the few, and there's another one sort of like it I didn't mention in Northern Australia, that's trying to hybridize both that that traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous peoples with some modern technology and techniques that have also been developed in other contexts. And so there's this really interesting kind of, like symbiosis between tribal leaders who are training some of the scientists and grounds workers who are there doing some of the work alongside them, who are also then training tribal members in some of the newer technologies and techniques that are there. So you have this kind of incredible collection of fire control and grassland restoration and ecological restoration work happening across the full spectrum, from traditional ecological knowledge all the way to the most advanced sort of scientific instrument you could imagine for that kind of work, and everything in between. It's the product of 20 plus years of engagement work there, right? That kind of began with Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Project, or program, excuse me. And it's just now kind of hitting the point where it's beginning to show some real results. So I think it's one that's like an interesting beacon, and it's only going to get more interesting. I think if you look at, the 30 some odd projects that are at the center of the book, you could say that about most of them. There are very few that were built more than about 10 or 15 years ago. Most of them are kind of just beginning to mature, and this is one of them.
Great, thanks, Billy. So that's a good, good, and we can, thanks for those references as well. We can definitely do a bit more investigation. So how are you going? One more question, or do you want to stop?
We can do one more if it's quick. Yeah.
One more. I'm not sure if it's quick. This is actually from Dennis Scott, who of course you invited to be part of your fantastic book, the 50th celebration of the publication of Design with Nature. So Dennis asks, quite a complicated question, the construction of a more intensive city area, have you been involved in incentive-based opportunities to develop new conservation areas at scale outside of the immediate context of the project, e.g. inner city urban forest to near forest regeneration to far away forest regeneration? Yeah,
I mean, the short answer to that is no, I haven't. And I think, if we're talking about, I think there's like a question here in a sense about almost like an offset sort of system, right? About, urbanization and offsite, sort of relationships. I mean, the short answer is no, I haven't been involved in those. I think I'm relatively skeptical towards that kind of mode of development for lots of reasons. There's an incredible new book from another of my colleagues I did not mention that's been out about a year now, called Ending Fossil Fuels. It's Holly Jean Buck, who you might know from some of her other stuff. She wrote a book called After Geoengineering. She's written pretty extensively about all of the kind of leading edge questions of how we might respond to climate change. And in this book, in Ending Fossil Fuels, she's really writing about the fossil fuel industry's plans to use concepts like net zero and to use instruments like offsets and carbon banking to skirt any sort of carbon management responsibility we might try to impose on them.
Right.
And for them, you know, that skirting can look like lots of different things, but, you know, offset forests that we've done audits on in the last 5, 10, 15 years have all shown to be pretty dramatically underperforming what was promised. So in some cases, you know, they're sequestering somewhere in the neighborhood of about 40% or so of what was modeled, which means, you know, if you're buying, let's say, offsite forestry or afforestation or reforestation projects, as a developer, as a way to offset what you're doing in a larger sort of urban environment, you're probably getting a pretty sweet deal because you're being credited with a lot more carbon sequestration or carbon management than you're actually providing by doing that. So, you know, I don't know what the right answer to that question is, but I know I'm always going to look at offsets with a pretty skeptical eye.
Sure. Okay, that's great viewpoint. So I think that's probably about it. Thanks very much for thanks obviously to Billy. That was really amazing. Fantastic conversation and amazing to see your projects and the publication. Very much looking forward to the book. Thanks very much to all the participants. We had, I think at one stage we had over 60, 70 people online. It's really a really great number to kind of listen to this important conversation. Sorry, we did actually end up having quite a few great questions, and sorry, Rachel, we didn't get to your question. We kind of ran out of time. But thanks very much for all the people that asked questions. And so just leaves me to thank Billy one more time. Good luck with the book. Good luck with future endeavours. And yeah, we're really hoping we can get you back to New Zealand. I know you want to come back. So we're really
anytime, yeah.
New Zealand and Italy. I know they're the two goals. So we're really hoping we can make those things happen for you. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me. Enjoy your day.
Thank you.